Welcome, everyone. This is Steve Mondrenuk with the Association of Food and Drug Officials. We're going to get started here in about another minute or so. Give people another minute or so to get logged in. We're seeing a pretty steady stream of folks logging in right now. And so we'll get started in about a minute. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started here. Thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. This is Steve Mondrenuk with the Association of Food and Drug Officials. And I'd like to begin by welcoming Catherine Simon, who's chair of our Laws and Regulations Committee, who is hosting this webinar today. Catherine, would you like to welcome the group?
Yes, this is Catherine. I'm really excited to see the number of attendees logging into this. We're at, from what I can see, at 196 right now, so that's really exciting. So for the Laws and Regulations Committee, we are hosting this as a webinar this year instead of something that would typically happen during our committee meeting at the educational conference. So this is going to be a good summary of some various state food legislation that's happened in 2019. And so, again, if there's any recommendations for other webinars to happen, specific areas of interest, know that this is not the end. Feel free to reach out to the Laws and Regulations Committee if there's additional interest, questions, or things that we can help facilitate and get out to you guys. So with that, I'll pass it back.
Thanks, Catherine. So today our speaker is Doug Farquhar. Doug is currently the Director of Government Affairs at the National Environmental Health Association and has been in that position for just over 1 week. Prior to that, Doug spent over 25 years with the National Conference of State Legislatures as directing the environmental health program there. Doug is an attorney by trade, has spent time working for the Texas House of Representatives, for the Natural Resources and Appropriations Committees, and for Congressman Don Schaefer on Capitol Hill in Washington. Doug is a noted expert when it comes to environmental health law policy at the state and local level, and is an amazing speaker if you haven't seen him speak before. Let's just go ahead and turn it over to Doug. I'm sure you all will have lots of questions for him at the end. If you do have questions and you want to submit them early, there is the question box. Go ahead and type those in, and we'll be watching, and we will have those ready for the end of the webinar. Thank you all, and Doug, please take it away.
Steve, thank you very much. I appreciate that gracious introduction. Today, as we were talking about, we are going to talk about enacted food legislation enacted in 2019 by the state legislatures. Interesting thing about food laws, we see quite a few, it's a very active subject area for state legislatures. We saw over 750 bills introduced on food and food safety in 2019, and we almost saw 20% of them enacted, which is extremely high level of enactment compared to other issues. Most issues we see around 10% enactment, but for food safety, we've seen double that. The most active states were New Jersey, New York, and Hawaii, and the only states that didn't have any bills introduced were Ohio and Wisconsin. In tracking food safety, I've identified these about 9 different categories of the biggest issues that are facing food in the state legislatures. Their foremost issue is food safety, followed by food facilities. Donation of food was a very popular issue in the past, not as much this year. Marketing of foods is a very active area. Issues such as food nutrition, food deserts, and SNAP is another category. Cottage food, food freedoms, laws to limit the regulatory oversight of foods is a major category. Probably the most interesting issue this year was, or in 2019, was cell-based or plant-based meats. Saw several bills on that. Edible cannabis and hemp is an issue that's emerging. And the final issue I'll talk about today is on raw milk and dairy. Now, the first and foremost issue that states dealt with regarding food safety. We saw over 130 bills introduced, 21 got enacted. Majority of these issues were not as as exciting as the ones we were putting there. Most of them are mundane issues, such as do we want to increase fees on this issue? Do we want to add things? But there are certain bills I wanted to highlight that I thought that this group would probably find interesting. Hawaii, as I said, enacts several bills regarding food. They have a very proactive effort in their legislature. One of the examples would be House Bill 463, which became Act 104. It requires the Department of Agriculture to establish a food safety certification training program to assist the farms to comply with the USDA Good Agricultural Practices Certification Program. This is an effort that kind of mirrors previous efforts that Hawaii has done to assist their farmers and food systems groups out there to comply with federal standards, to make sure that foods coming in from Hawaii are going to meet FSMA and USDA requirements. On the other hand, or not on the other hand, but in the other part of the world, North Carolina. North Carolina, the legislature this year authorized, which basically means they have directed their Commission for Public Health to adopt the most recent version of the the FDA Foods Code. So they put direct effort out there. Rhode Island, they put their Director of Environmental Management to make sure the state is in compliance with the provisions of FSMA, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act. South Carolina introduced and enacted a law which clarified that certain individuals are authorized to adjust food spoilage claims without an adjuster's license. There are many other aspects of food safety that have been done out there. I just wanted to highlight some of the more interesting ones. State legislatures aren't necessarily experts in food or food safety, so they are responding constituents' needs, constituents' concerns. And one of the foremost issues out there among constituents are making sure that their programs and their companies are in compliance with FSMA. Moving on, I want to talk a bit about food facilities. Food facilities, this includes restaurants, public schools, mobile food trucks, vending machines, retail food outlets. So there are many activities regarding that issue, food facilities this year. Some of the issues that I really wanted to highlight is California, and even though I only brought up one bill here, California had about 4 different bills dealing with that they enacted, dealing with food facilities. The first one, which we're highlighting here, regards micro-enterprise home kitchens, which basically are cottage food operations, prohibits the processing, freezing, or packaging of milk and milk products. And this includes cheese and ice cream. So this law, the reason I put it under food facilities, limits their cottage food operations so that it doesn't include milk or milk products. California also adopted Senate Bill 395, which authorizes the Fish and Game Commission to establish a pilot program for the issuance of wildlife salvage permits, meaning if an animal has been killed along the side of the road or has been hunted, they can, this will look at a process where they can bring in this wild game meat for human consumption. Another bill that was kind of interesting regarded the prohibition of the use of latex gloves in food facilities and retail food establishments. This was Senate Bill 677, and it requires food employees to use non-latex utensils, including non-latex gloves. Other activities that occurred out there that I found somewhat interesting was the efforts regarding vending machine and micro markets. As you can see here, in addition to some of the activities we've seen in other states, Mississippi had looked at this issue pretty closely. House Bill 1206 defines the terms for vending machine and micro markets. The bill exempts vending machines and micro markets which sell prepackaged food from regulatory authority of the State Department of Agriculture and Commerce and the State Board of Health. So this law limited the ability of the state to do oversight. Other states looked at vending machines, including Maryland and also Oregon had a look at this as well. But it is showing that there's an interest out there regarding the health and safety of micro markets and vending machines. New Jersey introduced the Small Food Retailers Act, which provides funding for small retailers who sell fresh fruits and nutritious foods that are locally grown. It's part of their Jersey Fresh operation. Other states that had interesting things out there, one of them I highlighted here, Louisiana, House Bill 335. It requires food facilities, meaning restaurants and etc., to notify patrons if the crawfish or shrimp that they are eating is foreign raised and not grown in Louisiana. Other issues regarding food facilities, which I'll highlight, is food trucks. Having the ability for states to oversee laws regarding mobile food trucks has been a challenge for the states. One thing I have noted often is that the industry, the food industry, is much more nimble and much more able to have new technologies introduced much faster than the regulatory community or the legislative community to respond to that. And one of the foremost issues out there is mobile food trucks. This has led in this year for Colorado to enact a law that basically says local jurisdictions cannot provide their oversight regarding mobile food trucks, that all regulations will be done by the state. Other things I found interesting out there, Oklahoma, it creates a permit for unattended food establishments, meaning vending machines. Oregon authorizes the State Departments of Agriculture, specifically their authorization to close food establishments if their operating permit has lapsed. Virginia amended their food establishments law, exempting any restaurant operated by a nonprofit civic service organization, a volunteer fire department, a volunteer emergency medical services agency from any requirements to employ a certified food protection manager. So certified food protection managers are no longer required for those types of operations in Virginia. West Virginia adopted several interesting bills in 2019, one of them being the Fresh Food Act, which requires all state-funded institutions to purchase at least a minimum of 5% fresh produce, meat, and poultry products from in-state producers. This is a bill that has been adopted in many states, including Massachusetts in the past, but has caused a little bit of consternation among the national distributors that provides food at the national level to make sure that they have a certain amount that is going to be produced in state so they can meet this requirement. Donation of food. Donation of food was a very popular topic in 2017 and 2018, but for some reason in 2019 we did not see that many bills on it. We saw 34 bills introduced, but only 6 were enacted. Some of these bills were very much like what occurred in California with Assembly Bill 614, which provides an income tax credit for person who plant crops, manage the crops, and harvest the crops from the land if they donate those crops to food shelters. That's the common standard law that we have seen enacted. Few other states, though, have done something a little bit different. Hawaii urges, the Senate Resolution 26 urges restaurants to donate any leftover food to homeless shelters. New Jersey Assembly Bill 4701 requires the establishment of an electronic portal system by the state agency to promote surplus food donation and to encourage collaboration among nonprofit organizations, gleaners, and food retailers to accept food donation from different institutions. Washington, they introduced and enacted House Bill 1114, which is designed to reduce the wasting of food. Marketing of food was another major issue that we saw in 2019. Several bills were introduced to try to promote the state's sale and purchasing of food. Massachusetts enacted and established the Restaurant Promotion Commission. Hawaii, Senate Bill 375 required the state's Department of Agriculture to develop a strategic plan designed to double local food production and increase food purchases from the state. New Jersey, AR 156, urged the federal government to increase the exportation of the state's dairy products to other nations. Food nutrition, food deserts, and SNAP. Bills related to food nutrition, food allergens, and food deserts, and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, food stamps, became very common in 2019. We saw 33 bills being introduced and 8 being enacted regarding these issues. 21 bills were introduced regarding nutrition and food deserts alone. 12 were introduced regarding SNAP. And this is an issue we have not seen in the past, this much interest in SNAP, in food deserts, or in the term, or in food nutrition. Food deserts, the reason I like to highlight this was because for many years I've had a lot of pressure to explore what states are doing regarding food deserts. And this is not something that state legislatures, not a term that state legislatures even used in the past. 10 years ago, the term food desert was not found anywhere in any bill introduced by state legislatures. But in 2019, we saw bills introduced in Indiana, Missouri, Texas, and Virginia that used the term food desert and trying to figure out ways to promote fresh fruits and vegetables to areas where they are not found. And states looked at areas not only in inner cities, but also in rural areas where you are not seeing a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, ways for the state to get that fresh fruits and vegetables to these food deserts in rural areas. Only one enacted this year. New Jersey's Food Desert Produce Pilot Program establishes a food desert pilot program within the state agency, establishes a program to provide residents in food deserts with access to fresh and affordable foods. I am encouraged to see other states adopt food desert legislation in the future. SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Programs. This is another unique area that we did not see a lot of activity in the past, but we're getting more so in the future now. I've seen several states introduce and enact legislation regarding SNAP to provide access to SNAP programs to give people more opportunity to use their food stamps and their SNAP dollars. One of the issues that USDA often has mentioned to me is that many states do not effectively use their entire SNAP allocation, California being the foremost. There are many policies on its books which limit people from using the SNAP. On the other hand, you have states like North Dakota, which use their full allocation of SNAP dollars within their population. So California, because of that, we are seeing more bills introduced to allow access to SNAP programs. California Assembly Bill 419 addresses SNAP dollars to provide more access to fruit, nuts, and vegetables. There were limitations within the state. They pulled those back. In Hawaii, Senate Bill 390 creates a state matching program for beneficiaries of SNAP who purchase state-grown produce. In the state, they've actually created, it's going to be a dollar-to-dollar match. So if you buy locally state-grown produce, for every dollar you spend with SNAP, the state's going to provide an extra dollar, which will encourage the purchase of locally grown produce. Illinois, Maryland, both introduced bills this year to allow SNAP beneficiaries to use their benefits at restaurants. New Mexico introduced and enacted Senate Bill 84 this year, which authorized the growing and use for food service of fruits and vegetables gardens at senior centers. So they're allowing senior centers to use their SNAP benefits for these such purposes. Cottage foods. This is an issue of great interest and concern for many people over the years. The application of cottage foods have expanded greatly. We're seeing a great growth in this area, and it's something that's been a real issue for several states out there. Really, at this point, in every state, you can sell food to the public without having any sort of state or local oversight, with the exception of New Jersey. And every year I see bills in New Jersey to encourage and create a cottage food program for that state. Just hasn't been enacted yet. Within cottage foods and within food freedom, there are 4 elements which I try to emphasize with state legislators. Basically, the first element is that it provides exemptions from licensing for small food producers that sell directly to consumers. There's usually a requirement that there's a label on the food that's stating the product has not been inspected by the state. There's a third element that there are rules out there for handling potentially hazardous foods, such as making sure that there's a certain amount of cooking time or temperature requirements to ensure safety, or that there's some sort of acidic protection so people who buy the food do not get ill. And the last thing is several states have introduced training courses for people who prepare such food to let them know what potential hazards could occur if they're going to be preparing these foods and they are not going to be subject to any state oversight. In 2019, we saw 59 bills introduced regarding cottage food and food freedom, with 17 being enacted in 13 states. Mostly what these bills do, they keep on increasing the size of the operation. Originally, cottage foods really were focused on very small producers, but every year they increase the size, saying, well, you can increase it to a minimum sales of 50,000, a minimum sales of 100,000. You can sell meat up to 1,000 head of chicken, or it's 5,000 head of chicken. Every year they get a little bit more lenient with these laws, permit more hazardous foods to be sold without regulatory oversight, or many of them alter rules on food handling, and they're growing greatly. One interesting element out there is the food freedom effort, which was very active and saw a lot of activity, a lot of interest in former years. This year, I only saw one bill on food freedom, which is basically a complete blanket exemption from any sort of regulatory oversight for foods. This year, only New Mexico introduced a bill, and that was not enacted. Cottage foods, we're seeing more things like California's Assembly Bill 377. As we were talking before, It prohibits a micro enterprise kitchen from producing, manufacturing, processing, freezing, or packaging milk products. Maryland, Senate Bill 290, it amends the definition of cottage food products to include food sold at retail stores or food cooperatives. So now in Maryland, you can sell unregulated, uninspected food at retail food stores. Texas, on the other hand, they cracked down a little bit on their cottage food law. In Senate Bill 572 now requires labels on cottage foods saying that these foods were made in a home kitchen that have not been subject to state oversight, and they may contain allergens. And the law also restricts internet sales. So no longer can a home cottage food operation sell on the internet and sell products over state lines. That's been the greatest concern about internet sales, is they would be in violation of the FDA food code and subject to the jurisdiction of FDA. Many states have limited the sale of such foods over the internet, and Texas was a good example of that this year. West Virginia, on the other hand, they really expanded the ability and sale of cottage food items. They have greatly, Senate Bill 285 greatly expanded the types of food that were allowed, the different places that foods can be sold, not just farmers market, but several other retail outlets. But they do require that there's a label on the food, that the food is not inspected and could contain allergens. And it also allows for local health departments to inspect facilities if there's a reported case of foodborne illnesses from these cottage foods. So the local health departments are not completely exempt from any sort of regulatory oversight of such foods in West Virginia, but they're extremely limited. It does require that there's some sort of evidence that there's been foodborne illnesses from cottage foods from these facilities. Maryland, again, back to food freedom. I'm sorry, the state of Maine, House Bill 583. This is a real fascinating bill, something I'm very much paying attention to. In 2017, 2018, we saw 3 states adopt essentially food freedom laws, and that was Wyoming, North Dakota, and Maine. And each one of these were slightly different, but basically said that there shall be no oversight of the preparation and sale of certain types of food. Each one of them was a little bit different. North Dakota expanded this greatly, but they did not include meat, whereas Wyoming, they expanded it and they did include meat products to a limited extent. Poultry, if you have less than 1,000 head of chicken, you can sell those chickens on the retail market without any state oversight whatsoever. So that's how broad food freedoms bills are out there. The original law in Maryland was much along the same lines. It said that essentially that the state cannot impose any regulatory requirements on food sold at the local level if the local jurisdiction allowed it to be sold. So essentially, if you go to somewhere along the coast in Maine and you want to purchase lobster, seafood, any sort of crustacean that they pulled out of the ocean, you can buy it right there, and they can sell it to you without any sort of food safety oversight. If the local jurisdiction says we are not going to regulate that and that's legal to do, the state was not going to intercede. USDA contacted the governor and said that is not going to fly. We are going to pull your delegated authority. You're not going to have the ability to inspect meats in the future. So the governor who was a very famous Tea Party anti-regulatory governor, called the legislature into special session saying we need to amend our law. They did amend that law, which would satisfy the USDA. Since that time, the governor has been term limited. We have a new governor, and this bill, House Bill 583, was introduced and circulated through the legislature in 2019. It was going to provide for a constitutional amendment that declares that all individuals have a natural, inherent, and inalienable right to food. And this would include the right to acquire, produce, process, prepare, preserve, consume, and to barter, trade, and purchase the food of their own choosing for their own nourishment, sustenance, bodily health, and well-being. This was going to be placed into the Constitution. It is still alive, this law. They have not, even though it's passed both the House and Senate, there are some discrepancies in the final language. Once that gets done, it will be before the voters in November, and if it is adopted, then we will have a very constitutional amendment which would be very adverse to food safety requirements. Labeling of cell-based meat. This is another issue that's been real fascinating. In 2018, we only saw one bill out there in Missouri, and it was adopted, and it basically said that defined the term meat and said who may or may not use the term meat. Since that time, we saw from one bill in 2018 to 60 bills being introduced in 2019 in 31 states, and 17 of these bills were enacted. Alabama, Kentucky, Maine, Montana, Colorado, North Dakota, South Carolina, South Dakota, Wyoming, all enacted bills stating that food containing cultural animal tissue that is produced from an animal cell cultures may not be labeled as meat or a meat food product. And the language varies in each one of these states, but for the most part, if it's a cell-based meat product, in those states you cannot call it meat. The industry has responded back and has really challenged this. And the one they are using as their examples legislation is Arkansas House Bill 1407, the Truth in Labeling of Edible Agricultural Products Act, which includes the language that you saw previously regarding cell culture of meat, but they also include other things such as cauliflower rice, saying that rice product can only come from rice, not from cauliflower. There's a federal court case on finding out whether this law would be legal, and or if it's an unconstitutional prohibition of their First Amendment rights to call cauliflower rice cauliflower. It's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, but the industry, certain groups in the industry are very concerned about these bills because it's going to put a limitation on plant-based meat products, which of course is tofuki, anything made out of soy, anything made out of a plant-based product, or the Impossible Burger is a very good example. Those would be illegal unless they are labeled under these laws. And of course, each one of these labeling laws are slightly different, which would mean that the Impossible Burger that is sold at Burger King would have to have certain specific labeling requirements for each state that they sell it in that have adopted this law. Louisiana's bill is pretty much on the same level as the Arkansas bill. It addresses meat products, but it also includes soy-based products and rice products, and making sure that they have to be labeled in a certain manner. The Mississippi bill, it also bans cell-based meat, but they also include insect-based meats or plant-based meat. You can't call a cockroach burger a meat product. It has to be determined as being made by cockroaches. Here has been the biggest and most fascinating change to the food safety landscape in the past few years is cannabis. Many of you remember there was a time where you could not put cannabis and you could not sell cannabis, and it was considered a Schedule I drug. The Obama administration changed that. They said they would not interfere with any state laws that legalized the sale or consumption of cannabis-based products. The Trump administration kept that policy in place to be certain that there is not federal law that exempts or permits the use of edible cannabis. It's just a policy that says that the Department of Justice will not oversee and will not come in and regulate on top of state laws. So therefore, if it's legal in a state, it's going to be legal. The federal government will not object. That's led for a lot of very interesting laws. The first and probably the most surprising thing that I hear from the state of Colorado, which was the first to address this issue, was the fact that nobody smokes this. When they passed this law, there was a lot of assumption that the issue was going to be smoking of cannabis. People don't smoke cannabis, they eat cannabis. And so that has put a great deal of pressure on the state legislatures to determine what an edible cannabis product is. In California, they passed a bill this year, Senate Bill 185, which states edible cannabis products means a cannabis product that is intended to be used for human consumption. Very broad standard out there in California. In Georgia, they enacted a law this year which is going to provide for the production, manufacturing, dispensing of low THC oil in foods, which is going to include either cannabis or hemp. Maine has another very interesting law that's going to be very relevant to this audience. House Bill 524 states that provides that food products that contain adult use marijuana are not considered an adulterated food product. So therefore, if they put marijuana into a potato and sell it, it is still considered a potato. It is not considered a new food product, which should be could be somewhat challenging to regulate. Other issues out there, one of the foremost issues that are really starting to emerge is hemp. With the adoption of the USDA food farm bill in 2018, in December of 2018, with the language putting in there where they exempt hemp from a Schedule I drug product, it allowed for the explosion of laws regarding hemp to be enacted in several states. Minnesota, Maine, Nevada, Oklahoma, and Tennessee enacted legislation specifically dealing with use of hemp in food. Much similar to the bill I just mentioned, House Bill 459 in Maine clarifies that food containing hemp is not considered to be adulterated, provides that the production or distribution of food containing hemp may not be restricted or prohibited. So again, Maine has really opened up and really lessened the regulatory oversight of food products, and in this instance, containing hemp. Nevada, they had a very proactive bill, a very all-encompassing bill, Senate Bill 209, requires the Department of Health and Human Services to adopt regulations requiring the testing and labeling of commodities and products made using hemp, including food products. So they have engaged the state agency to start regulating and providing oversight for hemp food products. Oklahoma, Senate Bill 868 modifies the industrial hemp agricultural pilot program to make sure that food products can include hemp and can be sold. Tennessee was an interesting bill. Senate Bill 537 seeks for the state to have primacy regulatory authority over hemp production. And so what they're going to do there is the legislature says the state shall seek delegation from USDA and from the Food and Drug Administration that all hemp products will be regulated by the state and not by the federal government. I also wanted to highlight real quickly here, raw milk and dairy. If you have been in this business for any length of time, you'll realize that over the years, state legislatures have gone out of their way to allow the allow consumers to get raw milk, which is still illegal on the federal level. Interstate sales of milk have to be pasteurized. But if you want to buy raw milk, in every state, there's some way for consumers to get raw milk. One of the interesting things regarding raw milk is the expansion of what they consider raw milk. Arkansas passed House Bill 1699, which starts the authorization for the sale of raw sheep milk. Other states have allowed for the sale of raw camel's milk, such as in Arizona in the past. California adopted legislation a number of years ago regarding goat's milk. So there are many different types of mammals that you can purchase the raw milk from and sell it to consumers. On the other hand, you have situations like in Arizona, which expands their definitions for raw milk. It allows establishments that sell frozen desserts, meaning ice cream. If you make it from raw milk and the dessert is manufactured and sold and consumed on the premises, therefore the state has no regulatory oversight on that. So that could provide interesting angle within the state of Arizona on how many industries, how many facilities are going to be starting to manufacture their own dessert products and selling them to consumers. Maryland, this was another issue that has come up that we've seen in many states. Senate Bill 922 prohibits the stating of a product that is milk unless it meets the definition of milk. What they're trying to target here is almond milk or other types, soy milk, other types of products that are plant-based, which are not milk that is coming from a mammal. This bill is trying to emphasize that milk is defined in a certain way, and you can't call soy milk milk, or you can't call almond milk milk. The same issue has occurred in Nebraska and Pennsylvania. They enacted laws this year that urged the federal government to set a standard definition of identity for the term milk, trying to put the pressure back on the federal government to deal with issues regarding almond milk and other plant-based milk products. With that, I'm going to say thank you. I went through these very quickly, but I wanted to make sure we had time at the end for questions. And so I was going to turn this over to Steve at this point to see if he has any questions for me or any clarifications I can provide.
Sure. I think we have two questions related to a couple of specific bills that are interested in a little more information. California 377 limited frozen milk and milk products in did you say that California 377 limited frozen milk and milk products in cottage food operations, or all milk and milk products?
The language that I have says prohibits a micro enterprise home kitchen, which would indicate that they're trying to focus on cottage food operations.
Okay, and then was it frozen milk or all milk products? I think was the second part of that question.
Oh, the language says prohibits a micro enterprise home kitchen operation from producing, manufacturing, processing, freezing, or packaging milk products. Okay. So it's all milk products, and including cheese and ice cream.
Okay, perfect. The next question was regarding the Maryland bill, S290 Act 370. Did it also allow restaurants or only food establishments to sell cottage foods? Or retail food establishments, grocery essentially.
Retail food establishments. My apologies, I'm going through my notes here. language I have with that one is it alters the definition of cottage food products. So it expanded it. It expanded the terminology of what they allowed to be sold as cottage food in retail food store or food cooperatives. The law requires the owner of cottage food business to submit information to the Department of Health before selling the cottage food product at a retail food store. So it does provide some extension of what is required of the cottage food product. But Maryland's much more restrictive than other states such as West Virginia. There are two other bills that Maryland adopted as well regarding cottage foods, which kind of rounds out how they are trying to address it. But the bottom line is the Maryland legislature makes cottage food more accessible out there to the public.
Okay, the next question I have is, this is kind of a general question. So this individual asked, how do I see what my state is proposing for food laws right now?
One more time, Steve, how do I respond?
How do I see if my state has any proposals for enacting food laws right now?
One of the things I'm hoping to do at NEHA, one of the things I had done when I was with the National Conference of State Legislatures is track all the state food laws. If you go, probably the easiest thing to do is just simply Google state environmental health legislation. The first thing that pops up is the NCSL database, and one of the categories is food. And if you look under that, there should be a list of, or actually there is a list of all the bills introduced in 2020 regarding food. The good thing about it is we do have it in a single spot. The bad thing about it is there are several thousand bills out there that have already been introduced on environmental health issues, and that means it's going to require you to go through, look at the summaries, and make a determination whether this is going to be an issue or not. It's not easy to track this, but we're trying to make it easier all the time and giving you some assistance to find out if you got a bill out there that you may want to challenge.
Great. So I guess another question that we have here is, what do you see in 2020 the impact of COVID-19 might be for state legislatures?
Well, there's quite a bit of impact. One of the foremost impacts is that they're not going to have time to address it. Many of the states, Virginia, Maryland, New Mexico, have already adjourned. And so, and one thing that they adjourned is they adjourned quickly. They adjourned sooner than they needed to, so they didn't have the opportunity to address COVID. It does not mean that they're not, and it just depends on the state. Several states are in session year-round, and if they're in session year-round, we're going to see bills emerge regarding COVID. You got several states that haven't gone into session yet, like Florida, that you could see quite a bit of activity in. But when you get a situation of a state such as Maryland, which is already adjourned, there we're going to see a greater limitation on what kind of activities we're going to be able to see on this. That being said, every state has provided their governor emergency, public health emergency capabilities. So if it's considered a public health emergency like COVID, that gives the governor quite a bit of authority to act. The tricky thing is that in every one of those laws, there are limitations, meaning that the governor can only act for 5 weeks, for 6 weeks, that the governor can only act under the parameters of their public health law, that the governor can only act until the legislature goes back into session. So there are limitations on what the governor can do. In certain states where the governor has been more proactive, you're seeing some pushback from the legislature, where you're seeing that occurring here in Colorado. And I think we'll see that occurring in other places. We've actually heard some pushback from the state of Maryland and from Michigan about saying, what is the authority that the governor actually does have to address this and to make these decisions without any specific authority from the legislature. And these are battles that are probably going to occur between the legislature and the governor. And it's going to be basically all we're going to have to say is it's going to be a real wait and see, especially in states where the legislature does not 100% agree with what the governor is doing.
We have another question, Doug, and noting that Wyoming had HB 155, an animal shares bill. Are you seeing similar type bills in other states?
Animal sharing regarding raw milk, yeah, that's a very common practice that you see out there, where they somewhat try to get around any sort of restrictions to the sale and purchasing of raw milk by doing an animal share program, where a group of people, or 5 or 6, can buy part of the cow, and therefore, since they own the cow, they are exempted from any sort of pasteurization requirements, so they get the milk themselves. When you talk to CDC about this is extremely problematic. If you are going to see an outbreak in the dairy industry, any sort of foodborne outbreak, it's most commonly going to be occurring in raw milk sector. However, there is, as I mentioned, always in every state an opportunity to purchase raw milk in some manner.
So, Doug, I think the next question I might ask is one that might be slightly off topic, but I know it's also your issue area. I know you also track cannabis legislation overall. Any updates or thoughts from the 2019 legislative year as it relates to cannabis in general?
Well, the first issue is that people eat cannabis; they do not smoke it, and that policy is expanding among the states. One of the most interesting things to look at is to see how quickly the adoption and legalization of cannabis has been across the country. When you first had the policy enacted, it was really, there was only a handful of states that allowed people to use cannabis, and it was very limited, and it was so limited it was practically a non-issue. After the adoption of the policy, certain states went forward aggressively, Colorado being the foremost example, but that's because it was a constitutional amendment. And so the citizens changed the Constitution, which means the legislature couldn't touch it, and it immediately legalized it. Since that time, we've seen it in almost every single state. I believe there's only 4 states in the country where you cannot purchase cannabis in food products in some manner. Many states allow for, they limit it to oils. Some states, they limit it to medical. But when you're even going into one of the states I've worked with is Alabama on this. If Alabama's going to adopt it, then it's basically going to be adopted nationwide. And I think the food safety industry should be very aware of what the standards should be, because in the past we can rely on the Conference for Food Protection, we can rely on the food code that has oversight from the federal government. In this situation, we have no oversight from the federal government, no protection. We don't know what standard is good, what standard is healthy. We don't even know what pesticides are on these products, and they are being put into brownies, they're being put into edible products, and being used quite commonly. So this is going to be something that we're going to see an expansion rather than a contraction. And it's really going to be up to the regulatory sector to identify where there are problems and how they need to confront them.
Just out of curiosity, and I bet that you know this number right offhand, how many states now allow recreational cannabis? What are we up to in this country, or do you have a good guess on that?
Well, I'm going to give a good guess of about over half, but I don't have the exact figures in front of me. I do have that on another slide in my information packet, which I'll be glad to share with you after we follow up with this.
Okay. It looks like we have someone asked the question, what do you mean people don't smoke cannabis? Great question.
Yeah. Yes, they do. And if they smoke it, it's not your problem. But if you're a food safety official and they eat it, then it is your problem.
In other words, edibles are very, very popular across the country and becoming more so. I think that walks us through. Any last advice do you have for regulatory programs and working with the legislature? Anything you think would be helpful for them to know before we end the webinar today?
This is something I often said and something I've learned from the agricultural community. When you deal with the departments of agriculture, they have a mantra, which is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And this is the way they engage with their policymakers. They're very proactive in dealing with not only Congress, but with their state legislatures. I've never seen the same level of interaction among the state food safety regulatory officials with their state legislatures as I've seen with the Department of Agriculture. So therefore, my bottom line is get engaged, introduce yourself to them, make sure that they understand who you are, and when a bill comes up, see if there's an opportunity for either yourself or the retail food industry to provide comment. The legislature is responsive to what their constituents tell them, and if they only hear from one side and not the regulatory side, they are going to follow the non-regulatory effort. One of the issues I've heard often with Cottage food is I only have people come in saying what a good thing is. Nobody has ever told me that there are problems with Cottage foods. So my bottom line is for the food safety regulatory folks to get engaged.
Great. And boy, that's a perfect place to end with the last question. Are you aware of any foodborne outbreaks associated with Cottage food? And Caleb, yes, we will get you some information. There's at least one very large one that was related to botulism coming out of a Cottage food from California. And I believe the outbreak was largely centered in Ohio. Kind of an interesting one, but there are others. We'll get you some more information on that, Caleb, and you'll see it here the next day or two. Thank you for that question. Doug, we want to thank you very much for participating today. Congratulate you on your new position with NEHA, and we look forward, as always, to working with you in the future.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate the time.
So thank you all very much for joining us today, and have a wonderful weekend.